much. Thank you very much. We will get started fairly shortly. While you're taking your seats, I just wanted to bring your attention to the Twitter handle and Twitter hashtag. There's been a lot of tweeting this morning. For anyone who isn't too sure of the Twitter hashtag, it is IDWL14 and the Twitter handle is at empowerwomen_AU. So please keep that Twitter traffic going. There's been quite a lot of it this morning. Thank you very much. We'll get you to take your seats and we'll get started for the next session. Thank you very much. Thank you. And just to repeat, for anyone who was wondering about the Twitter handle and the hashtag is IDWL14 and the handle empowerwomen_AU. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Please take your seats. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. We're going to get straight into the next session now. This very important section now, we're turning our attention to corporate Australia and from middle management to executive leadership, creating a 50-50 pathway to the top. And leading this session, I would like to introduce Narelle Hooper. Narelle is a corporate communicator, company director, broadcaster, expert in her field. Narelle is a former editor of the Australian Financial Review's award-winning Boss magazine, and she has been associated with the AFR and Westpac Top 100 since its inception. She's a dynamic communicator. Narelle, please, welcome. And Narelle will introduce her panel. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good morning. Sandwiched as we are between the G20 and the 350 years of women's underwear fashion exhibition, right next door. Given the kind of subtle layers of social context, I think it might be worth dropping in later to have a look. So I've got 4 fantastic guests joining us now. I'm not going to muck around getting them up on stage, but I did want to get a couple of impressions from you once we're up. So this session is very much about the step change that we need in the engine room of the economy. So for the very important role politics and society plays, there's the deal makers, the money makers, the people that make and distribute and sell the goods and services that make our world go round. And with very minor exceptions, and despite all the research that is now showing a very strong correlation between diversity in management and financial performance and long-time financial performance, it seems immune to that logic. And when everyone's talking about measurement and so forth, it just strikes me as a little bit odd. Recent Harvard Business Review research ranks worldwide that most companies are asleep on gender. And those that have critical mass, now importantly, they define that as 25% or more, are rare indeed. And just out of some research that Boss magazine did recently, we've seen some questioning now of that 30% tipping point that we've all taken for granted. So we might explore that a little bit later. But with me this morning, and they're in alphabetical order, I'd like to welcome Maria Atkinson. She's an internationally recognised sustainability strategist. You're coming right here, Maria. Only because the tech guys will have my head, otherwise. She's a director of the angel investment company XO Proprietary Limited and a director of Holcim Foundation and St James Ethics Centre. Now, up until a couple of years ago, she had a very distinguished career globally with Lend-Lease. So please put your hands together and welcome me. Woo! You've got fans. To her right will be Patricia Cross. Now, Patricia is a director of Macquarie Group and Macquarie Bank, London-based Aviva plc and chair of the Commonwealth Superannuation Corporation. After senior executive roles with Chase Manhattan and Banque Nationale de Paris and National Australia Bank, she began working as an independent director in 1996. Welcome, Patricia.
Thank you.
Belinda Hutchinson is our third guest this morning. She's the Chancellor. You've already met her, so I don't need a huge introduction for her CV, but she's also Director of AGL Energy and was previous Chair of QBE Insurance. Before that, she was an Executive Director at Macquarie Group and Head of Macquarie Equity Capital Markets. And she was also Vice President at Citibank in Project and Corporate Finance. So please put your hands together and welcome Belinda. Now, last but not least, on the other end of the room, and one of my favourite Tasmanians is Allison Watkins. I have a small association with the state, so I thought I'd give it a plug. Allison's Group Managing Director of Coca-Cola Amatil, and before that she ran the agribusiness group GrainCorp. She's had non-executive roles at ANZ and Woolworths and was Head of Regional Banking at ANZ. Before that, she spent a decade at McKinsey. I reckon you deserve some kind of a medal for that. Really? Please put your hands together. Welcome Alison and our viewers. Now, there's been a lot going on this morning, and there's I'm sensing quite heightened interest and feelings in the room. I just briefly wanted to bounce off your impressions of some recent comments. So we had Anne-Marie Slaughter this morning, where she said we've had only half the conversation, and the gender revolution, which is male, where we're kind of imitating that structure. And then Jane Halton's argument about balancing up our caring and other work roles. So did anyone want to pick up and just give your impressions?
Well, I
Patricia,
think
I'm looking at you.
Yeah, no problem. I think that it is the critical ingredient is socially normalising that women do have the ability, and there are great advantages to having them participate in leadership roles. Mm. And I think that any woman that is currently in leadership does have a duty to really help to socially normalise that. Mm. So I think that it is all about leadership.
Mm. Belinda?
Yeah, I think we have to get beyond the debate about quotas versus targets. You know, to be honest, it's about the societal stereotyping. It's about cultural issues. And I don't know whether you want me to go into it now, but I did want to talk about the Hunger Project, which I see as a micro pilot almost of what happens when you really do get women to step up and be 50-50 in terms of community and what outcomes can be achieved by doing that. But it's we do that now, we can do it later.
Can I get you to pause with that?
Yeah, I'll put that on the pause button.
But it's a really important example, and I'm really conscious today that we're having conversations across where different norms in societies and different issues that have dear to all of us. So corporate sector here might look quite different in other countries, so it would be good to draw out some of those experiences as well. The other aspect of this is in the audience today, where are the Clayfield College HSC students? Any others? I saw some others up the back there. Yeah, you shout it out, please.
Yeah.
Trinity? Thank you, welcome. Are you relieved? Now you're going to unwittingly help me in my next quest, because when I was researching this, the topic is international, in the international dialogue, it's pathways to executive management, 50-50. And I want to just pose that question about, we talk about 50-50. We think there's a social rightness to that. We've worked really hard for many years, and there's a lot of logic behind this. So first question, is it desirable, and I'd like a response from the audience here, so is it desirable to have 50-50 in our corporate sector? I think you can do better than that. Is it desirable to have 50-50 in our corporate sector?
Yes.
Okay, next more tricky question. Do we believe it's doable? I like that. I had a conversation that, yeah, we're going to the HSC students now. I want to ask you, do you actually believe that in our lifetimes we will see this? And I want to be positive, but I raised that because I had a conversation with some colleagues, and that was the question that came up. A number of them just said, I just don't believe it's going to be doable. Clayfield College young women, will you give me your impressions of what you'd like to see out of this session, bearing in mind it's the corporate sector, it's the engine room of our economy in a way?
Absolutely, I think it's possible.
Yep.
I don't think it's something that we can expect to happen tomorrow. I think it'll take time, but I definitely agree on some of the points that were that came up about it's all about changing the social norms and the cultural attitudes. I think that's really about what it needs to be about, and that's something that we study a lot at school in English, is about ideology and what underpins everything and all of that sort of thing. So I think it's definitely possible. I'm not sure if it's something that we will see, but I definitely think it will happen.
Anyone else? Thank you. So what date would you like to set? Are you prepared to wait until 2095, I think Dame Quentin Bryce said? Be bold.
Maybe 50 years?
Okay.
Let's do one.
Oh,
Come on in. Yep.
I'm a big Sheryl Sandberg fan, and she always says, you know, we may not, like her, like middle-aged woman, she said we probably won't see it in her lifetime, but we'll see it in our lifetime, and I definitely think that we'll be able to do that. I think our school, we're surrounded by amazing women who just are advocates for change and for women's equality, and I think that's so important, is to inspire younger women, to hit them first, you know?
Yep. And how about the men, the young men? Are they along for the ride?
Yeah. Well, I think Emma Watson is a great advocate for that as well, because she just launched her He for She campaign, and I think that's amazing, because gender equality is about men and women. It's not just a woman's problem, it's about men as well. We have to work together.
Thank you.
Well done.
Thank you. We'll come back to some questions shortly. Belinda, I'd like to just pick up on this notion of belief, and you believe it. What date are you prepared to see this by?
I don't see why we can't achieve this by 2030. I mean, one of the things I was talking on the way in today was, we all know about Moore's Law. You know, Moore's Law is about transistors in computers, and they double every 2 years in terms of capacity. Why can't we apply Moore's Law to the women's issues? So, you know, there's no doubt we can do this. And I look back on my own early career, and what happened? There was no maternity leave. I could not get a loan from a bank because I was a woman and I might have children and I may not pay back that loan, so I couldn't get a mortgage. So you think about the change that I've seen in my lifetime, and I just don't see why we can't achieve this. And I think there is now a serious engagement at government, high levels, senior levels, business senior levels, in the not-for-profit sector. You know, we do have the ASX corporate governance guidelines. They do set targets. Those targets are now being reviewed by senior executives and by boards. It's part of their whole way of being, the same in government. So I think we are really heading in the right direction, and I don't see why we can't achieve really significant change.
Alison, how effective are those corporate governance principles? In your
Narelle, first of all, I was wondering whether I could swap places, and maybe one of our colleagues out here might like to come and sit on the panel, because aren't they fantastic?
I know, I'm scared. But they are.
Look, I think the corporate governance guidelines, the measurable objectives, are very effective, and they're a device for ensuring that there's focus at board level, there's focus at senior executive level. And, you know, I was just reflecting, as Belinda was talking about the amount of change I've seen, and particularly in financial services, where when I was working as an executive in financial services, which is probably about 15 years ago, the proportion of women in management, I'm going to hazard a guess, but I would say it was probably maybe not much more than half what it is now. So today, all of the major banks have 40% or thereabouts of women in management. And it is quite a dramatic change. It's easy to focus on, what we don't have and what we'd like to achieve and to see the shortfalls. But I do think we have come a long way, and I absolutely believe, if we could double women in management again in the next 15 or 20 years, well, we could have 80% women in management. Is my maths right, Dad?
We might even exceed the...
Not much chance of that, I guess.
The new G20
I do think,
target,
we can continue to accelerate. And there are some, and we might come back to this, but there are some important sort of, next layer considerations around targets and the progress that we're making generally, which are about the nature of the roles that women are playing. So it's great that we've got the focus on broadly on measuring women in management, women on boards, women at different levels and so forth. But a particular passion for me is which roles are we getting women into? So particularly how many line roles, the roles that run the businesses that control the P&Ls, as opposed to the functional roles, which are also really important in organisations, so human resources or marketing or finance. They're really important roles, but we need to make sure that we've got women across not only those functional roles where we tend to be disproportionately represented, but also running the P&Ls, because that's what gets women through to running large organisations.
It's so important. The statistic is 6.2% according to the OWA right now in line management roles. So we've got to increase that. And it's really the women that are in the leadership roles that really have to drive that hand in hand with the men.
Correct.
So that's the Workplace Gender Equity Agency stats. And actually, seeing you brought this up, so I did some quick sums. So currently, this is 2012 data. The new data is coming out, but 2,289 roles. Now, this is just listed companies, and I'm really conscious there's a whole other private aspect that WGEA is monitoring, and there are something like, there's thousands of companies in that loop, but mostly in those key management roles, 6.2%, as you said. In the support roles, 22% of women in that. And that includes things like company secretary, human resources, IT, public. I don't see how IT is a support role now. It's so fundamental.
Exactly.
Now, you had something to say there, Maria, and I'd like to get your response, because there is an issue here about we focus on the P&L, but there is a broader debate about the decision-making processes and the input of different perspectives into that you
So I want to be a champion of functional roles, and I think there's an unconscious bias towards, I'd like to see in 5 years that we get to 50-50.
Thank you.
In an ASX top company, and here's a pathway to it. Imagine if at 22% we actually valued the roles of General Counsel, of human resources that changes its name and talks about culture and gives cultural pulse and a conversation and statistics and information around people. The communications, which we know is critical to reputation, with social media that we're seeing here today, it's got to be a strategic position. The women that look at environmental and social activities, sustainability and strategy, that they're sitting there at the C-suite and they're there. You've already given the statistics. So I would say that we have an absolute bias by saying, let's get women into functional line roles. And I would say, I can only give my perspective, but I chose not to do that. I chose to live my values in being a sustainability expert rather than go into running a line of business. And I think women make choices when they see the top. So on Carol Schwartz's position, let's have more visibility in women at the C-suite, which will enable women to be inspired if they choose a function, if they choose a line management P&L opportunity, then they've got more, I think they've got the inspiration of seeing women at the top. And as Jane said, then we're having a different conversation, aren't we?
Alison, what's the capacity to have that different conversation? Because there is a kind of narrow definition of success and the critical contribution to the organisation's success. This is a different, very different perspective.
Well, no, I mean, I agree. All senior roles are are important and I think are recognised as such and contribute a lot of value. And I certainly, of my senior team, I have sort of 5 people who run businesses and 3 very senior support roles, and they're all incredibly important. I have a female CFO. I have a female HRD, a Human Resource Director, who is absolutely critical in driving some of the cultural change we need. I would love to have a female running one of our businesses not because I think those roles are more important, but those roles touch a lot of people. Some of our business roles have thousands of people reporting to them, and I know that if I have females running those businesses, I'm going to be able to drive the kind of cultural change down through those thousands of people more effectively than if not. So I'm really looking for a mix across all the roles rather than a concentration of women in functional roles and not in the business roles. That's really what I want to achieve.
Can I just make a point on that? Because I think Alison's raised a really important point. If you look at the ASX 100 companies, 80% of them have some form of workplace flexibility policies to enable women to be included in their workforces. But we've still got an incredible problem at the top of these organisations in the C-suite with a very, very low percentage of women. It's less than 15%. So what is the problem? We've got these policies, it all looks like it's good. But you know what? It's up to the individual manager to make a difference. So when I was President of Chief Executive Women, we did some work with Bain & Company, some research, and it was absolutely clear that unless you get the individual managers to take on these sort of policies and really promote them and look after their individual employees, it's not going to happen. So I think Alison's absolutely right, because that's where you've got the bulk of the people. That's where you've got the bulk of the managers. We have to drive leadership training down through organisations so that every person, every rung of the leadership ladder, they understand they have a responsibility about diversity and helping women. It's absolutely critical. So I think it's great to have the functional side, and I think that's really important because they can drive cultural change, but we've got to also rebalance on the P&L side.
Right. And that, Patricia, did you have
I was just going to say, I love what Lenine Ford said and Oya Azarcian. They both made similar type of comments. That Lenine said, it's all about intelligence and compassion and understanding. And you can see how women do drive those values. And Oya said they're less individualistic and more encouraging. And certainly that's been my experience. When I think about all 7 of the listed companies that I've served on boards of, the women are, as a generalization, and indeed, much more facilitative and humanistic and consulting. And I think that that's just such an important behaviour to encourage. And I think that it's entirely consistent with our sustainable objectives because it's those type of behaviours that will keep the company around for the long run and will keep the company producing in a really efficient manner in the economy in the long run. And as an investor, that's one of the things that I look at. And in fact, I heard from Matt Christensen from AXA Investors at the ASFA conference last week that they are now putting gender diversity in companies as one of their 5 criteria for investment in investment managers. So that's you get more people doing that. Well, it's going to be really fantastic. And AXI, the Australian Council of Superannuation Investors, are also putting it onto their agenda to look at women on boards. But you do have to go further than women on boards because you've really got to look at that trickle down. And this is the key point for the G20 for achieving this narrowing of the participation gap, is that there is a correlation between women in senior management and increasing participation rates of females. You see that very much so in the financial services industry, the insurance industry, and in the retail industries in Australia, in the US, and the UK at least. And so my question is, there's still a big gap between women on boards, especially when you look in Europe. I spend a lot of time in Europe, where the boards are kind of moving up between the 20, 30 to 50%, and the senior executives are really down very, very low. So a key part to narrowing the participation gap, which is the G20's objective, is that we do have a very effective way of trickling down. And I would argue that's by having women in leadership roles that use more new age, 21st century leadership styles to really encourage people to get in there and live the values of their companies.
So just divert quickly. You picked up investors, and the task today is to figure out the pathways from middle management to executive management. That's what we're hoping to do. But this issue about investors, and it's our superannuation that is at stake here. How many investment analysts and fund managers actually drill through this stuff? Alison, Patricia, Belinda, and
They're starting to, aren't they, Alison?
Yeah, I'd say some, but really it would be the minority, I'd have to say. Having just come back from an investor trip, I could say I might have had one question that was really not specifically about women, but more about just non-financial type market factors. I do think, AXI, I think AMP also, I notice here. So there are some investors that focus on it more. It's one of those interesting questions, though, to me, whether it's, it's a correlation or a causation question. And I think, what I observe, the more enlightened companies here in Australia, the more enlightened leaders are much more proactive, and they do generate better returns. It's hard to say, is that because they choose women, or they choose women because they're better companies and better leadership generally. I'd love to have investors challenging us on it more, and I hope that perhaps investor pressure from people like us can create that, but I don't see it happening yet.
Narelle, I just need to tell you though, because last week at the ASFA conference, which is a national conference of over 1,000 superannuation trustees and managers, it was really top of the agenda, the diversity agenda. So the investors, the people that are managing everyone's money in Australia, they're very interested in it. We know that CalPERS, that US investors are also interested in it, the Ontario Teachers Pension Plan. We all know about the pressure that CalPERS put onto the Facebook listing because there wasn't a woman on the board initially. So the investors, I think, are really switching on. However, the analysts, now that is a different breed. Those are the people that comment about companies and write their research. These guys are still on another planet. And I think Alison agrees. So I had something fall into my lap last week that shouldn't have fallen into my lap. It was a series of research reports on a retailer that I won't name. And it rhapsodized lyrical from these analysts about how wonderful the stores were. And, I can tell you as someone who does that weekly shop, who does that daily grind of, making sure that there's stuff for the teenagers to eat, that chain's going off, right? It's jumping the shark. And and the analysts haven't picked up on anything. It's really interesting. And it's because they're all men who might occasionally proudly go off to a supermarket and buy a couple things, but they don't actually know,
Seeing as we're looking for actionable, practical things we can take out of this to change the world, what would it take in your roles to actually raise this with the analysts and investors and start to make it change the conversation to seeing as we all care about it, to raise that as part of the conversation? Is that doable?
Well, I think it has to be in, the analysts and the investors' KPIs at the moment. A lot of the Australian investors I observe they're very, very focused on near-term performance, and if we could encourage, I think, our investors to have a longer-term orientation so that they're thinking more about sustainable organisations rather than the next 6 months' results. Once you start thinking about sustainability, you start thinking about a whole lot of non-financial metrics, including diversity and the ability of the organisation to renew itself and generate its own management talent and a whole lot of other aspects as well. So that would really help. But I think it's really about how we hold those investors to account.
I mean, actually, I have to defend some of them because the research analysts...
You don't have to here.
at Goldman Sachs actually came up with an outstanding report and has come up with 2 outstanding reports around what is the contribution that women can make to companies and to GDP. So their analysis was that if we actually did achieve equal representation of women, then there would be a double-digit increase in GDP contribution. Now, that's just outstanding. The business case is absolutely clear, but they really drove it hard. I'm not going to say the Productivity Commission, I'm not so sure, drove it quite as hard, and that was a bit disappointing.
Yeah. It's a really good point, actually, Belinda, because Credit Suisse have also done a very similar, very in-depth report. But I think maybe they should give it to their analysts and say, yeah.
I say so, yeah. So I
it's very
tweeted
interesting because I
those
just don't
reports.
see it coming through in the way that their analysts
Well, it's
or
not-
their funds.
And,
Yeah,
and
it's
the
not a
Goldman
holistic
Sachs,
discussion.
the Goldman Sachs report's international too. So
Yeah.
it talks about a 14%
Yeah.
potential improvement in Europe, and 10% in America, 21% improvement in Japan. Really great possible
Yeah.
improvements.
That-
11% Australia.
Yeah, I guess
Maybe the Chinese walls are getting in the way or something.
well,
you know.
there are some other internal issues, but we might. There's a couple of people in the audience might like to bring that up, and I'd like to come to you because you see Maria sees a different way through here. Briefly, first, I'd like Belinda. You talked about the Hunger Project, and that to me, because I'm struggling to find examples of 50-50 right through the organisation. Tell us how effective that has been in actually mobilising finance, growth,
I just had
feeding people.
I loved listening to Winnie last night because Winnie comes from Uganda and Winnie has been a great proponent of the Hunger Project, and my family have been involved with the Hunger Project now for probably 8-9 years, but particularly involved in Malawi, and I went to Malawi just a month ago. We have been supporting a community there of 10,000 villagers, and the basis on which we engaged the Hunger Project, I call it we because I really do feel part of it, engaged with that village was that it was only on the basis that they would go through a major culture change. That major culture change was about equal representation of women on the village council. That was the basis on which they had to agree before they got involved in this program. Over a 7-year period, that the lives of those villagers has changed dramatically. They now have total food security. Crop yields are up 3 to 4 times what they were before. Their food banks are overflowing. They're able to sell excess grain into the other villages and make money. They have a microfinance program which is only run by women. So we went to the rural bank. We've been there a few times. The fact is, there's only women there. The repayment rates on those loans, these are only $50, $100, but it allows these women to buy cows, goats, whatever. Men can also borrow from the rural bank, but the women run it. The repayment rates are almost 100%. It is quite extraordinary. And it just shows that if you empower women, if you get women to the table, you can make enormous social change. The change in terms of early childhood education there, because the women are demanding that. The change in terms of actually getting women some teaching, some learning around literacy, around numeracy. These women had no idea. How could they negotiate when they went to the other village to sell their grain unless they knew about numbers? These women now have the numbers down like you've never seen. They're fantastic. But it's really been an eye-opener for me and for my family to see what happens when you have 50% of the women in senior leadership roles in this village. It is changing the lives of 10,000 people. So for me, this was just a little microcosm of what can happen when you get 50% in terms of representation.
Maria, what can we learn from that in
Well, I
corporate
think,
life?
the whole idea is that when you get this 50-50, we end up with a multiple outcome. So if I take it to executive life, in 2006, then a corporate company, Lendlease, established a sustainability committee on the board, which meant that information flowed to the board. And with that, it was critical for me to say, well, what information should go to the board? So it was a global head of diversity. Let's put a woman in that role and let's work on a diversity roadmap and let's get cultural pulse information to the board about what the people in the organisation, globally across 40 countries, were thinking, feeling, etc. Then let's have a look at the foundation. Where are we directing the charitable, the philanthropy money? What partnerships were we putting together and how could we involve the diversity and the supply chain in that component as well? So those two things, and those individuals came out of human resources with great expertise and knowledge. So they then got in front of the board, so women were seen by a board. Then we moved on to risk, climate change, environmental protection, and we looked at women looking at that. We looked at social inclusion and reconciliation action plan, and a woman led that. So by having one sustainability committee in 2006, there were a whole lot of women sitting in middle management that were given projects of importance that elevated roadmaps so they could demonstrate that they were commercially astute, because of course if you're sitting in a commercial listed company, you've got commercial acumen or you wouldn't survive. So you get to show that there are smart individual women who've got strategic ideas, and then the board gets to see that information and in their own strategy, charting the next 5, 10, 20 years of the company, can rely on that information. Now, this was all before social media and big data, so there's no excuse now for that, that process that was 2006 to not be something where information at monthly intervals is flowing up, but also as investors. So we have a barcode that we scan, a line on the barcode that includes information about human rights and the participation and empowerment of women, can easily come as it does about genetically modified food, whether it has it or hasn't. And I can have an app on my phone in purchasing or looking into a company, whether these statistics, if they're important to me, I can make investment purchasing decisions. And that's what we have to get to if we're going to believe a 5-year 50-50 in corporate Australia.
On that score, there is some research that came out through some of the WGEA material that Boss Magazine analysed, and it shows, we often think of this as a pyramid. You get in, you get 50-50 in, and up the top you go, and you know, it's hard work, but you get there. And what's happening is that women are getting frozen in the middle, not even the middle. The glass ceiling kind of is right down here. So, less than a third of them kind of they stick at that, and so it becomes a needle for women. That for men it operates more like a pyramid. And I just wonder about the mental, given this whole issue around caring and flexibility and so forth. The mental health effects of that must be huge. And I wonder what kind of organisations we are that this is what we're doing. Well, we've got a legitimate role to make money, but how do we change that?
Well, you know, when we do the executive coaching, and you know, we all have to wear the health strap. So executive, we wear a 48-hour strap, and it reads our stress levels, etc. And it was interesting that I was the first woman in a particular program that is national that they'd ever dealt with, an executive woman. And I didn't need advice on diet and health and fitness, but I didn't have a wife, and so my stress levels were quite different, and I ended up with autoimmune hemolytic anemia, which is a complicated thing for and idiopathic. We don't know what it is, but the stress after 6 years of being offshore every 2 to 3 years, and doing that role played out in me in a physical way. Right. So I think that there's mental and physical impacts of any high-paced executive role that we could all speak to, but I share that as a way of saying it is an unhealthy way that we force an executive level, and we force the kind of the pace of this. And that's why I come back to, I think women make choices.
Go on.
Well, I think women make choices from my feedback at Lendlease. In all the roundtables, the brown paper lunches, all the things that we had were, why can't we get more women into, whether it was line management roles or not? And, you know, it was really that women make a decision and they leave and they establish. The reason why I'm an angel investor is because I'm backing, and there's wonderful groups that focus on women-led organisations, but I'm backing women starting up businesses. They're leaving enterprises and they're starting kind of disruptive new businesses. And I think that women are making a choice, and I think that's wonderful that there's choice. There's all sorts of routes. You can go on a board, you can participate in an executive if you want that corporate route, but you can also go and do a startup, and women are leading small to medium businesses. I don't have the stats, I should have looked that up, but it's extraordinary the amount of women making that choice.
Yeah, I made the choice, Narelle. So I made the choice 17 years ago. I had a great job at the NAB. I was the only woman on the executive committee, the first woman to ever, get to those lofty heights and all that. And it was a terrific job with over 1,000 employees globally. Great fun running the Treasury and the Wholesale Bank and Corporate Bank and, the Dolce Vita. But the fact is that I was working 80 hours a week, and I felt to be effective in that role, I really needed to be able to work the 80 hours a week and travel to wherever at a drop of a hat. And I had 2 children and another one on the way, and I just felt like I wasn't doing justice to my family or to my husband. And I made the decision to change gears. And so that was way back in 1996. I was encouraged, Alison and I have spoken a lot about having a great mentor sponsor. I was encouraged by my boss at the time, Don Argus, who said to me, look, Trish, what's going to happen is all these old guys on boards are going to die off, and they're going to be keen to have women with financial experience and line experience, and so you should be a company director. So, but I did make that choice, and many women have said to me, and I'm sure you've heard it too, Belinda, that they, especially women, say, well, you really should have stayed as an executive, and really tried to drive more direct change. So now I'm trying to make amends, and I'm trying to be, I'm trying to be less of a X because I operated as a male, the whole time. Rosbeth Cantor from Harvard Business School talks about X's and O's, and unfortunately, I think I just emulated the X's, and I think Alison and I have chatted about this. So I eventually, I was burning out, and I still have autoimmune problems also, and it's,
So I'm just imagining what we're missing out on in that decision-making capacity that we really need.
But I think we can get too negative, and I think I think the fact is the world is changing, and I think what you experience is absolutely right. A lot of women have experienced, but I think the world is changing, and I think if you look at the male champions of change, which Kevin spoke about earlier, I think that's about leadership saying, we don't want this to happen anymore. So what do we need to do? We need to sponsor women. We need to make sure that when they get to those middle ranks and they want to have families, that we look after them, that we really make sure that there is someone who sponsors them and brings them back into the workforce. And it's about celebrating that. I've got some great examples that I can give you. Like at AGL, we had one of our really high potential and very senior executive female wanted to go off on maternity leave, and then came back and wanted to come back. She didn't want to work full time. She only wanted to work 3 days a week. That was just fine because she was great. We found a guy who wanted to work 3 days a week. So they job shared as the head of tax for AGL. That's a very big and important job in that organisation. She did that for 2 years. She's now back at the table, and she's been promoted to the head of risk. That's a big, big job in a company like AGL, which is an energy company with lots of risk. He has got promoted too into another finance role. So it's a really good story, and we're celebrating that success. And there's lots of stories out there like that. And I've got another great story, which is I really want to tell. My daughter had a very, very premature baby early this year. She already had a 1-year-old. And this baby was going to be in hospital for 3 months in intensive care. It was a really shocking situation. Her husband works for IBM. He called up and said, the morning after this baby arrived, very unexpectedly, I need 3 months off. I need to look after my baby. I need to look after my wife. I need to look after my other baby. You know what they said? You've got 3 months paid maternity leave. Now that is exactly what we need to hear, and we need to celebrate those sort of successes. Those things are happening out there all the time now. So I am actually really positive and enthused by this, because I can see that companies are saying, why would we lose the talent that we have? We've invested in these women for 10, 15 years. Why would we lose them? That's just crazy. You think about the leadership training, the other training that these companies put their people through, the same with the government. It doesn't make sense anymore. So I can see a real shift taking place. But have we got it right? Will there always be the anecdotal story of someone who's not been treated right? And I've heard a lot of those too, and I can give enough examples of those to make me want to cry sometimes. But the fact is, the world has changed. Those policies are there. We've got to see them through. We've got to make sure that we absolutely stick to them and we don't give up. It's got to be top agenda, and it is top agenda for boards and senior management now. We have to keep it there.
That's why you have to socially normalise women in leadership, because then the policies will be used. You have to have the policies being used. So you have to have the leadership in place that actually sets the plan to improve diversity, but you also have to have the policies, the enablers, and have people feel free to use them in an incredible way.
Now, there's a number of tools. CEW and the Male Champions of Change have worked together on a toolkit. There is an issue about trying to get that broader than the mainstream corporate life and so forth. But it's quite a good segue. Where's Danielle? Merritt? So one of the US studies postdoctoral people is Danielle Merritt. And if we could get a microphone to Danielle, she's a behavioural economist. She's been doing some fascinating work. And it reinforces why in every pool you need to have 50-50 in mind. Can you share that with us, please, Danielle?
Thank you, Narelle. My name is Danielle, and I'm a researcher, a behavioural economist at the University of Sydney. And I'm interested in the way you think, the way you make decisions, and how we can use that to advance women and the opportunities that we can all take advantage of. So we ran a few experiments with some Harvard professors at the University of Sydney, and what we found is that the decision set that we all face actually has an impact on our biases on how we make decisions. So how you design the choices has an effect, and that has an effect on if you have more men than women in that decision set, then subconsciously people are biased towards choosing a man candidate, even if the woman candidate is better. And the reason for that is because it's easier to evaluate men against other men. So subconsciously, we can evaluate things better when we have a comparison. But if you're the only woman going for that CEO role or the board role, then that means it's really tough for you to stand out because there's no comparison of other women to show how well that you've done or how you can shine. So there are some new ideas and interventions that we can do in trial, which is what we're all about here today, looking at new ideas and looking at the candidates. If we can level out the playing field of men and women candidates before we even get to the selection, we can de-bias that choice set, and that can really help us get a fair and competitive outcome for women.
Thank you very much. That's great. So this is a good time to go to questions, unless there's any feedback on that.
I just feel like Alison's hiding that light under the bushel about your selection process becoming CEO, because I think that's a very important story, that you do have to put yourself forward.
I think definitely. It's one thing that I certainly wasn't very good at earlier in my career, and I was fortunate to be surrounded by other women, and particularly Diane Grady, who was a very good role model for me early in my career. And I can she'd always say, you can't hide your light. And I used to watch her and think, how does she do that? She's so, she was so out there and in your face, and she used to give the other partners at McKinsey such a hard time, particularly around diversity and the need for change. And I used to just sort of look aghast. But then, for me, I really, I guess as I matured as an executive, I really realised that you are so much in control of how you react to situations, how you can have a mindset that you are much more in charge of your own destiny sometimes than sometimes we think, rather than feeling like a victim. And so for me, the last couple of senior roles that I've been invited to apply for, I've really gone at it with that mindset that I'm going to take Diane's advice, and I'm not going to hide my light one bit. I'm really going to put my best foot forward. And I've had other situations where I've thought I've done that and I've missed out. But at least I felt okay about missing out, because I knew I'd put my best foot forward, rather than that awful feeling that I think sometimes we can end up with as women, as feeling like, why did they, they chose him because he was, he was beating his chest and making a lot of noise, and we feel like we kind of missed out.
even though we probably had the right qualities. So I think that's something that I really learned, is to make sure that, you know, in a way that feels comfortable and true to your own style, but that you are effective in getting those messages across, that you really think about who you're getting the messages across to and how you cut through.
Fantastic, thank you. We'll take questions. I wanted to quickly, Sam Mostyn there, and can I also acknowledge we've got fantastic people who've been working in this area for years and years in the audience, so it's good to get that. Sam, we'll go to you. There's someone up the back. There's two questions up the back, and then we'll come back down here. Thanks.
Thanks, Narelle. I just wanted to test a theory that comes from listening intensely to the last session, and particularly Jane Holcomb's comments, and all of you in your various ways of leading this debate today. Have we reached a point where we need to change the entire language of work and remove the word maternity, part-time, and actually build flexible workplaces where we remove all of the gender bias so that men are encouraged to apply for all forms of leave? To your point, Belinda, about your son-in-law and actually wanting to be with the baby, he actually asked for that because he needs flexibility around his parenting skills. So we have parental leave that everyone can seek depending on their needs. So rather than speaking to each other about are you part-time, full-time, and immediately dropping down into, so if you're part-time, you're not as committed, therefore you're probably a woman back from maternity leave with no ambition. We actually say, how much leave do you take every year to balance your life, male or female? Have we got to the point where we actually have to remove the language to actually encourage enough men to be behaving differently, so women emerge as equals, and as they move up the ladder, using flexibility as well, depending on their choices, that they haven't had this unconscious bias of language prevent them from a rapid move. If we're going to get this target hit as quickly as we all hope, isn't something fundamentally got to change in the workplace?
Who wants to start?
Well, I think it's a really bold and exciting idea, and if you think about it, our large organisations were sort of, you know, formed out of the Industrial Revolution, and they were created by men for men, because they were created in an era when really only men used to work, and women, and it was really, you know, it's really the pill, I think, that really changed the ability of women to have more control over, you know, how they continued their career, how they managed their career around family and so. So pre the 70s, or whenever, the 60s, whenever the pill was invented, which I think really was quite a formative time. That's how organisations operated, and so the role of women was quite a distinct one from the role of men. Now it's really morphed a lot more, and now technology even more so makes it, you know, the old sort of constructs of 9 to 5 and 5 days a week. Why do they exist? They don't need to exist anymore. And you know, I think it's very exciting to see Telstra, for example, who I think every role can be part-time, but to actually remove that language altogether and lose the construct of full-time, part-time. I think it's a really exciting idea, Sam.
That's going on my list.
You have to align your incentive structures with that. So in many countries, there's still a big difference between part-time and full-time in terms of entitlements, and you really need to address that. So you have the leadership of taking away the language, and then you also have the enablers of making sure that people are fairly paid.
Thank you. Question up the back, thanks.
Hi, Annie Beaulieu. I guess I wear a few hats. Work for the G20 Research Group, as well as a global investor in the Hunger Project, and a social entrepreneur, so woman starting my own business. I'm a true champion of women leadership, but I think we also have a responsibility of driving diversity and really actively seek women equal participation. But I think we can also drive or champion diversity beyond just women, right? I mean, incredible panel, but also not just, but, you know, English women. We hosted a panel on Wednesday at the Youth Forum for the G20 Global Cafe, and we actively sought a young African guy, a European woman, and 2 other young person and 1 woman. And the diversity of the conversation was great, and we challenged much more of the thinking by having different point of view. And I think by our diversity, I mean, it's the International Dialogue of Women in Leadership, part of the G20, we have an awesome opportunity to bring different feedback to try to assemble those issues, because you cannot
create a solution by having the same level of thinking, and we will just drive those solutions if we bring more diversity. So I would like to think about, or ask you the question, what can we do as women to drive that women leadership, but also to drive that diversity agenda even further?
Is it a proxy
Well, I
for
think the
difference?
panel, it's a cheap shot for the panel today, but it's a point that we should address. But women can also bring diversity, so we can have different racial, age backgrounds, etc. So let's not get off the women subject and go to diversity as though it's not female first when we're a minority. I mean, that's just one comment on what you've said.
But I think you're absolutely right, though, in terms of broadening the debate. This debate is about female diversity, and that's what we want to achieve here. But I think companies have an absolute obligation, I think governments have an obligation to ensure that we have much greater diversity at senior leadership areas. You know, the fact is that QBE Insurance, we put in place a diversity program. It wasn't just about gender, it was about race, sexuality, age, the whole lot. And we are now managing and making sure that we measure how we're going in managing those outcomes. And I think you look at senior management in Australia, whether it be in government or universities or companies, and what do you see? White faces of males. So I think we've got a big job to do. You look at the community, you walk down the street in Sydney, you walk down the street in Brisbane, it doesn't look like that. We've got to change that as well. I agree with you.
And all of the research now, again, supports that diversity and good perspective taking, which takes time to listen and respect perspectives of other people that are different from yours. That's how you get the best decision making. It takes more time, of course. There was that, I think we're going down here, in the second row, Cassandra, and then I'll come to you, Dr. Moody.
Thank you. I guess the thing that I've been listening to has been, it's very easy for us to ask the question, and this is going to be a question, about when are we going to, do you think it's achievable? Can we reach equality? When do you think we can reach equality? I just want to ask the panellists, when you say, yes, I think we can get there by 2030, do you mean you can get there for people that look like us, sitting here in Australia, or do you mean we can get there for the world? Because I feel like we should be talking and being very, very clear that we're meant to be talking about equality for all women, not just for women, inverted commas,
Very
like
good.
us. And then the other question is, when you're asking about saying that you might be able to get there, or you think you can get there, do you mean assuming that as of tomorrow there's dramatic change in the rate of change? Because at the current rate of change, the mathematics show that we will never get there.
I think you'd be very brave to say you can get there in 2030 for the rest of the world. You look at the cultural barriers in some countries, it's absolutely impossible. But do we have to show leadership in terms of Australia, the US, Europe? Absolutely. And demonstrate why there is absolutely an economic and social case for this. The economic and social case is absolutely clear. You know, when you look at the work that McKinsey does, Catalyst, and, the Bain, the list goes on, it's absolutely clear. But we have to demonstrate by putting it into place, then we'll get that roll-on effect. But it's not going to happen in 2030 for the world, sadly.
Dr. Moody.
Hello, Anne-Marie Moody, the Boardroom Consulting Group. About 15 years ago, I wrote a book for the AICD called 21st Century Board Selection, Performance and Succession. And as part of my research, I interviewed a lot of company directors, and guess what? A lot of them were men. And I said to them, where are the women on the boards? And he said, these men said to me, we'd love to appoint more women, but we just can't find any.
Oh, there was one here a minute ago. I'm so sorry. She's gone now. Sorry, I just had to.
That obviously can't be an excuse anymore, and I'd like to congratulate the panel and the organisers of this event, because in front of us we've got women representing CEOs, chairmen, chancellors, non-executive directors, and I think that gives us a lot of hope for the future in Australian boardrooms, so thank you. My question is about the one conversation that we heard this morning. Can you tell us about your experience with working with boards and senior executive teams, but particularly boards? Do you see the one conversation? And if so, so, what do you do about it?
It depends on the board, doesn't it? Because where you have more women on the board, there isn't the it's an inclusive conversation of everyone, and you don't have that separate issue. So I think the first thing you have to do is to try to change the constituency of your boards. And so, for example, the 30% Club is coming to Australia to embrace 30% of women on boards at least by 2018. And most of the ASX 20 chairmen have signed on for that because it does change the conversation. When you have at least 3 women on a board of 10, say, it ceases being an issue that you're the only woman. I mean, my first few boards, listed company boards, I was the only woman, and it was a big deal. But it ceases being an issue. Macquarie, we have 4 women actually on the Macquarie Bank board, and it's just not an issue.
Just to pick up on that, Patricia, that's at the board level, but a really tough competitive culture like a Macquarie Group and so forth. How's that progress going in terms of bringing women from lower levels in management up and having them endure?
Well, when I think of all 7 of the listed companies that I've served on, 6 in Australia and 1 in the UK, and they're all top 20 companies, they are universally committed to trying to improve ratios of women in senior leadership. And it is a combination of trying to change the social expectations of the workforce so that they can recognize that women are credible leaders. And so what these organizations, in general, I mean, all 7 of them really have done is they've actually set a plan and an objective towards improving the diverse constituency in senior leadership and saying that this is actually something we're going to do. It's not just about appointing a diversity champion. It's about actually having a plan, like a strategic plan, where you actually have solid activities and actions to address it, and you inculcate that throughout the organization. And at the same time, you exhibit leadership capability that says, we think it's okay to be touchy and feely, and we think that you should be listening more and you should be inclusive. And the companies, all of them, are constantly assessing the engagement in the workforce and how happy women feel to actually advance. And there are women and men who opt out, especially younger men. And that's something that all of these companies are really in touch with and really concerned about, because the whole world really has changed. I agree completely with Belinda that there will be an acceleration in progress because men and women have changed their minds about families, Sam. It's not a male-female issue. It's a business issue that people want to work differently. So the combination of socializing it as a norm, as a normative factor that you have women in leadership, combined with encouraging people to use the enablers, all 7 of these companies are doing that and really making great guns. The one that's really fabulous, for example, in terms of the reporting of it is Aviva. In the UK. So I think a lot of the UK companies are really lifting the game on their reporting.
But you've absolutely identified the problem, Narelle. You know, the fact is we may be getting close to having 30% of women on boards, and you know the fact is we may be close to having 40% of women in mid-executive levels. It's that problem, and that's why we're here today, is to talk about how do we move that middle-ranking executives up through the organisation. And I think the research that's been done by Harvard and the University of Sydney is absolutely critical, because I think if you see what happens in terms of selection panels, by making sure that you have women coming forward as candidates, insisting that you don't just have one female candidate, but 2 or more female candidates is absolutely critical. You've also got to have females on the selection panel. You know, you've really got to make sure these things are done properly, so we build that pipeline. There's lots of things we need to do. This is not an easy solution. This is not a one, I always say, is there a silver bullet? No, there's no silver bullet. Okay. This is about a holistic program of change whereby you build on how do we get these women through, not just by one measure. There's a whole bunch of measures which we could talk all day about, but I think
we won't, by the way.
No, we won't.
I'll wrap you up on that. I'd like to go to Catherine Fox, who's seen some of the case studies of some companies. If we could bring a microphone down, and then I'll have that last question, and then you can have the floor. Thanks, Catherine Fox.
Thank you,
often joined at the hip, Catherine Fox, author of 7 Myths About Women at Work.
Colleague of Narelle, so partner in crime. let's be
There's no former.
destroying the joint, etc. Just a couple of things about the case studies, and Belinda knows well the work that Chief Executive Women has done, and they're putting up some terrific case studies of organisations in Australia that have successfully used a number of levers to create progress towards gender balance, and I would refer you to have a look at them. They're freely available. Woolworths, we're about to launch Treasury, which have had some extraordinary changes there under Martin Parkinson, and it's quite revealing. So I think when Quentin Bryce mentioned last night, we have to have a discussion about how those levers are available. We have great research, Danielle's mentioned it, and we have local data now, really good data to look at. So I think it's kind of a question, I guess, for the panel is, in a way, is what do we need to translate that and to get more take-up in organisations? But secondly, a much bigger question, I suspect, which is not actually about gender so much as the sort of extreme worker model of those very high-level jobs, because I think until we shift that, and Patricia, you mentioned that, the 8-hour weeks and so on, how do we change that? Because for men and women who have other caring responsibilities, they are toxic. So just 2 points.
The toxic workplace. Did
Well,
you want to...
Mark Consulting, MOIR recruitment, they ran they traditionally place finance people into executive roles or board roles. And they said that they believe that we're 6 months away in Australia of having 2 people represent for the one role in senior recruitment roles. So I just think part of Sam's thing is the opening the mind to the possibility of, let's talk about why not at executive level have the job sharing model of 2 for that as well. So it doesn't just have to be that an 80-hour week is in a construction industry. That is the reality of any project. It's 6 or 7 days a week. It is 80 hours. So the capacity at that junior level to job share should be mimicked at an executive level as well. So just opening our mind to that fabulous idea.
And that, I'm conscious I missed the question up there. I've got the clock ticking down. That does come back to that very powerful lesson about a lot of the barriers are in here, and it's what we allow ourselves to perceive and imagine. So I would like to thank you all for your input today. To the Clayfield and Trinity, all the best and get in there. And to our panellists, to Alison, Belinda, Patricia and Maria, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Narelle. Thank you for such a fabulous session. Thank you very much. And while the panellists are getting comfortable back, when they're ready back to their position, some of you might be feeling a little bit of the heat in the building. I've just been told there is a problem at the moment with the air conditioning across the entire building, and building maintenance are working as quickly as they can to overcome that. Now, we've heard a bit about the research that has been done in conjunction with the US Studies Centre, and it's key research. It's already come up in discussion twice or 3 times. We're going to hear more about that very research now. It is research that looks at the number of candidates and how that can affect performance. And to discuss this research and to also link it to the work in the Kennedy School at Harvard, I would like to introduce now, please, Melissa Grah-McIntosh from the US Studies Centre, who will speak about this research and also link us to Harvard University. Thank you, Melissa.
Before I introduce Iris, I might see if she's there. Can we get Iris up on the screen? Yay. Iris Bohnet is Professor of Public Policy and Academic Dean of the Harvard Kennedy School. She is also Director of the Women and Public Policy Program, Co-Director of the Behavioural Insights Group, and Associate Director of the Harvard Decision Science Laboratory, and the Faculty Chair of the Executive Program, Global Leadership and Public Policy for the 21st Century for the World Economic Forum's Young Global Leaders. Iris is regarded, well, she's a leading researcher, the world leading researcher on behavioural economics and gender equality. Her research focuses on nudges, in her words, on how our minds work and how, if we change the environment, it becomes so much easier for us to overcome biases. Iris is joining us next year at the US Studies Centre at the University of Sydney as a visiting professor, and we're so pleased that she'll be here under the W21 initiative. And just as pleased that we have her here today. Please join me in welcoming Iris Bohnet.
Thank you so much, Melissa. Patricia, for this kind introduction, and congratulations to everyone for putting together such an amazing event. I'm delighted to be here with you, even though not in person. And I was sorry to hear that you're a little warm. I can tell you that it snowed here in Boston yesterday, so do enjoy the warmth as long as you have it. So what I want to do with you in the next 10 minutes is share with you some of our research on the business case of gender diversity and talk about some of the emerging, really exciting collaborations that we now have ongoing with the US Study Center at the University of Sydney. So first, let me think a little bit with you about what the business case really means for us. And of course, we could talk about gender diversity on corporate boards, or we could talk about gender diversity in senior management and government. And these are surely some of the discussions that you've had, and I just had the pleasure of listening in your previous discussion. But I don't want to actually start there. Because truly, one of the most important studies for me, which personally touched me, is a study that Rob Jensen did in India. And I think it's also going to resonate with you because it shows the business case in a somewhat different way. He was interested in the question of gendercide. So gendercide means that now the UN is estimating that about 158 million women and girls are missing in Asia because of sex-selective abortion or neglect in the first 5 years. And he was wondering whether something that feels so entrenched and maybe cultural and difficult to overcome, whether something like this might even respond to economic opportunities. So what he did is he exploited the fact that call centers moved into India in the 90s, and they had an interest in hiring women. So he ran a field experiment where he offered training, or he hired a company that offered training to about 200 villages and offered training to these women to go and work in call centers. And then he had a control group of 200 other villages which didn't receive the kind of training. And what he was interested in measuring wasn't primarily whether these women then go and work in the call centers, but whether these economic opportunities affect how parents treat their daughters. So think of this as returns on investment. And in fact, so he measured body mass index, he measured survival rates, he measured school participation rates, and could show that in about 10 years, these sex ratios, which were very uneven, were changed towards in favor of little girls because these women now had a value for their parents. So that's why I think we should really care about providing economic opportunities for women, because they actually can be a matter of life and death. And somebody just before asked about equality for all women, and I certainly agree with that, which doesn't mean that we shouldn't start in Brisbane, in Sydney, in Boston, wherever we are, with what we can do at home. But of course, there are other studies, and if you're interested in particular in the question of is there a correlation between gender diversity in corporate boards or senior management, I suggest to you to have a look at the recently published Credit Suisse studies, which look at the 3,000 largest companies in the world and look at the correlations between gender diversity, both in senior management and on the board with company performance. So this is my first point. Yes, there's a business case, and the business case, whenever we talk about the business case, I suggest to you to define it really broadly. This includes survival. So if there is a business case, why is change so slow to happen? And you've heard a lot about unconscious bias yet, and I don't know whether anybody has mentioned the Orchestra Study to you already, but let me quickly remind you of why this actually is an important study and something that you can also use in your communications with others. So what the study looked at was that many major orchestras really around the world now have auditions behind a curtain. So they have the musicians come in, and often they actually ask them to take off their shoes, so you couldn't easily detect their gender. And they play the flute, the harp, and the violin behind a curtain. And as you might not be surprised to hear me say, this significantly, dramatically increases the likelihood that women and other underrepresented groups are hired into orchestras. So of course, blind auditions or blind evaluations aren't typically practical in your job or in my job. And much of my work, as Melissa has said, looks at what we can do in lieu of curtains. So how can we change the environment to make it easier for our biased minds to get it right? This is not about pointing fingers at you or at me. It really is pointing fingers at all of us, because these are shared beliefs. And if we don't see female CEOs or female professors for that matter, or if we don't see male kindergarten teachers or male nurses, we don't naturally associate these jobs with these demographic characteristics. So that's what our work is about, changing the environment to make it easy for our minds to get things right. Let me give you an example. Danielle has already talked a little bit about some of the work that we do with US Study Center, and I'll get back to that in just a moment. But let me put this kind of in a broader perspective. Many hiring decisions and many promotion decisions in many of your organizations, and I know you represent a wealth of organizations in this room, private, public, NGOs, but many of these decisions are made in a decentralized way. And what we find is that when we bundle hiring or promotion decisions, and you make more than one decision at a time, diversity is much more likely to emerge. We've talked a bit about finance in the previous sector, so in the previous session, so keep your finance head on for a moment and think of these as portfolio decisions. When you promote 10 people, when you hire 5 people at the same time, you think of the portfolio of people you want to have in your organization. And that's, for example, something that I was lucky to be able to introduce at Harvard as academic dean. We're now trying to bundle our professorial searches so that we make decisions about at least 3 candidates at the same time to make sure we think about the portfolio of appointments. With Danielle, and really under her leadership at the US Study Center, as you've already heard, we've just started a really interesting research project looking at, so to speak, shortlists. And many of you will have shortlists whenever you hire a new person, or also when you think about your promotion decisions. And our question was, as you already know, a very, very simple one, and that is, does the fraction of women or any other underrepresented group on that list affect the likelihood that a woman was going to be chosen? Now, of course, statistically, it has to be true that the more women you have, the more likely it is that a woman is chosen. But that, of course, wasn't our question. The question that we asked was, what if you have a woman or any other underrepresented group, call them O's or X's, as Rosabeth Moscantor likes to do, whatever that person is, if that person is clearly dominant, better than everyone else, is the likelihood of her success, is it dependent on how many like her there are on the list? And that's what we're uncovering right now in our ongoing project, and it certainly looks like there's something magic about an equal split, where we have equally as many women and men, in order potentially to signal something about the quality even of the best possible candidate. Now, as you hear us speak, I hope you hear some of the passion that we have for research. It's not just research for research's sake, but I think people like Melissa or Danielle or I or Bates from the US Study Center, we feel very, very strongly that we should think about gender the way we think about unemployment or inflation. We should bring the best evidence to bear on the question and be extremely rigorous. So if you'd like to learn more about some of this research that we've now also translated for practitioners and decision makers around the world, you can Google the Gender Action Portal, GAP, at Harvard University, where you find about 100 studies on how to close gender gaps in economic opportunity, health, education, and political participation summarized for decision makers like you from around the world. I'm very excited to be spending next half year, starting in January, at the US Study Center at the University of Sydney, working with many of the people, I hope, and seeing many of the people in person who are in the audience today. I'm collaborating with Michael Hiscox, a colleague here from Harvard who's currently at the US Study Center, with Danielle and many others, and a number of organizations already in Australia, private and public, which in particular are interested in overcoming this evaluation bias by improving how they hire, how they evaluate, and how they promote. Because what we really need to do at this point is we have to hire talent for the future and not the people who just look like us, who we have been hiring in the past. Thank you very much. And if we have time, Melissa, I don't know, but I'm happy to take questions.
I think we have to take questions because I know we will have questions. And I can't quite see, but is there a mic? Great. I can't actually see hands. Thank you.
Hi, Iris. It's Bates here in Brisbane. Welcome. We're so happy that you're going to be joining us next year in Sydney at the University of Sydney. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the relationships that you're trying to build up here in Australia? You said that you're working with some public and private organizations already. If it's not possible for proprietary reasons to name names, maybe just a little bit more on why these organizations have taken the step to work with you, and what are they trying to achieve?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much. Great to hear it from you, Bates, and I look forward to being with you next year. Yes, so I don't think I can say too much at this point, and I can't say a lot about the organizations for proprietary reasons, but also, and that might be interesting for the audience also, because we actually will be running experiments in these organizations. So we don't want to influence our results by now talking about how we are redesigning how these organizations hire or promote. But, I mean, they include, the government in different parts of Australia, for example. And I think the reasons for them to be interested in our work are really twofold. One is, and many of the panelists before talked about that, I think there's increasing awareness that it truly is the right thing to do to be inclusive and to be diverse. And so that's, I think, a beautiful thing that we're seeing also in the Australian foreign policy, reflected by its investments in women around the world. And secondly, and that's, of course, true particularly for the private sector, but also for the public sector, that the evidence that gender diverse teams, also something that the previous panelists talked about, that gender diverse teams outperform homogeneous teams is really increasingly evident. And so I'm actually seeing change everywhere. My sense is that many organizations would like to do something, but don't always know how. And that's where we come in and give advice on the how, but also suggest to these organizations that don't just run with whatever we're telling you, but learn. Create a learning environment where you try something out. For example, with one organization, I can be a bit more specific here, we'll actually do blind evaluations. So this is an organization which used to have promotions across the world, in a very decentralized way. And so the first thing we do now is we have one promotion committee. That's for the very senior level to promotions to partner. So we have one promotion committee looking at all 120 shortlisted people, and at the end they'll select about 30 of those. So one is one promotion committee, and then the second one is, well, we want to have some of the evaluators looking at these candidates blindly with the names removed. So we'd like for the people to experience in the moment of what that bias really means and how they could actually do better by improving the procedures.
I think we're actually out of time, but please join me in thanking Professor Iris Bohnet.
Thank you very much, and that's it for the morning session. We'll be back promptly in just under an hour at 1:30. So we'll see you then. We've got many more panels, much more discussion. Thank you very much.